A joke sent her to a cowboy's bed, but she returned carrying his child. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant cattle as the stagecoach rattled along the dusty road toward the small frontier town of Cedar Falls. Inside the cramped compartment, Eleanor Bennett pressed her face against the grimy window, watching the endless expanse of Wyoming territory stretch toward the horizon. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, leaving behind everything familiar to visit her younger sister Josephine, who had married a shopkeeper and settled in this remote corner of the world 3 years earlier. Eleanor was 26 years old, unmarried, and according to the standards of Philadelphia society, dangerously close to becoming a permanent spinster. She worked as a seamstress in a dress shop owned by a widow named Mrs. Crawford, spending her days stitching elaborate gowns for wealthy women who barely acknowledged her existence. Her life was small and predictable, filled with routine and respectability, but utterly devoid of excitement or passion. When Josephine's letter arrived begging her to visit, Eleanor had saved every penny for 8 months to afford the journey. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Cedar Falls General Store, and Eleanor gathered her skirts to descend the narrow steps. Josephine was already running toward her, arms outstretched, her face radiant with joy. The sisters embraced in the middle of the dusty street, while curious townspeople watched from doorways and windows. Eleanor had not seen Josephine in 3 years, and the changes in her younger sister were remarkable. Josephine had always been the pretty one, but now she glowed with contentment and health, her cheeks pink from the mountain air, and her eyes bright with happiness. Josephine's husband Harold was a kind but quiet man who ran the general store with methodical precision. He welcomed Eleanor warmly and helped carry her trunk to the small apartment above the shop where they lived. The accommodations were humble compared to Eleanor's boarding house in Philadelphia, but they were clean and comfortable, and Josephine had clearly worked hard to make them feel like home. That first evening, the three of them shared dinner, while Josephine peppered Eleanor with questions about Philadelphia, about their parents, about mutual friends and distant relatives. Eleanor answered as best she could, though she found herself distracted by the strange sounds of this frontier town, the occasional gunshot in the distance, the howling of coyotes, the raucous laughter from the saloon down the street. This was a different world entirely, and Eleanor felt both frightened and exhilarated by its wildness. Several days passed pleasantly as Eleanor settled into the rhythm of Cedar Falls. She helped Josephine with household chores, explored the small town, and began to relax in a way she had not experienced in years. The people here were rough but friendly, and they accepted her presence without the rigid social judgments she faced constantly in Philadelphia. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor felt almost free. On her 5th evening in town, Josephine suggested they visit the saloon. Eleanor was shocked by the proposal, insisting that respectable women did not frequent such establishments. But Josephine laughed and explained that things were different in the West, that the saloon in Cedar Falls served as the social center for the entire community. Married women often accompanied their husbands for dinner and dancing on Saturday evenings, and no one thought less of them for it. Against her better judgment, Eleanor allowed herself to be convinced. The saloon was larger than Eleanor expected, with a long wooden bar, a dozen tables, and a small stage where a man played piano with more enthusiasm than skill. The room was crowded with ranchers, miners, cowboys, and townspeople, all drinking and laughing and enjoying the end of a long work week. Josephine introduced Eleanor to various acquaintances, and Eleanor smiled politely while feeling completely out of her element. It was at the bar that Eleanor first encountered the group of women who would change her life forever. There were 4 of them, wives of local ranchers who had come to town for supplies and socializing. They welcomed Eleanor with exaggerated warmth, complimenting her dress and her sophisticated Eastern manners. Their leader was a woman named Lucille Hawkins, a sharp-featured blonde with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. As the evening progressed and whiskey flowed freely, the conversation turned to the unmarried men of the territory. Lucille mentioned that the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties was a rancher named Thomas Callahan, who owned a vast spread in the foothills of the mountains. He was 32 years old, handsome as sin, and wealthy beyond measure. The only problem, Lucille explained with exaggerated sympathy, was that he was desperately lonely and too proud to court any of the local women. Eleanor listened with polite disinterest until Lucille leaned close and whispered that Thomas Callahan had a particular weakness for educated Eastern women. He had mentioned more than once that he dreamed of finding a refined wife who could bring culture and sophistication to his ranch. Lucille suggested, with an innocent expression that fooled no one except Eleanor, that perhaps Eleanor should pay the rancher a visit. After all, what did she have to lose? The other women quickly joined in, encouraging Eleanor with enthusiastic agreement. They painted a picture of Thomas Callahan as a romantic hero, a rugged gentleman who would sweep her off her feet and save her from a life of loneliness and spinsterhood. They gave her detailed directions to his ranch, assured her that he would welcome an unexpected visitor, and even suggested what she should say when she arrived. Eleanor refused initially, insisting that such boldness was entirely improper. But the women persisted, and the whiskey she had consumed loosened her inhibitions and clouded her judgment. Josephine had disappeared somewhere in the crowd, leaving Eleanor alone with these new acquaintances, who seemed so sincere in their encouragement. By the end of the evening, Eleanor had agreed to ride out to the Callahan ranch the following afternoon. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable, telling Josephine only that she wanted to explore the countryside. The ride took nearly 2 hours, and with each mile, Eleanor's courage wavered. What was she doing? This was madness, the kind of impulsive behavior she had spent her entire life avoiding. But something compelled her forward. Perhaps the whiskey still affecting her judgment, perhaps a desperate hope that her life could become something more than endless days of stitching seams in a Philadelphia dress shop. The Callahan Ranch was impressive, with a large timber house, several outbuildings, and corrals filled with beautiful horses. Eleanor dismounted at the front gate, smoothing her dress and patting her hair into place. Her heart pounded as she approached the front door and knocked with a trembling hand. The man who answered was not what she expected. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his worn cotton shirt. His face was tanned and weathered, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue like a winter sky, sharp and intelligent, and filled with obvious surprise at finding a well-dressed Eastern woman standing on his doorstep. Eleanor introduced herself using the speech the women had helped her prepare, explaining that she was visiting from Philadelphia and had heard so much about his ranch that she simply had to see it for herself. She mentioned that mutual acquaintances had suggested he might appreciate the company of a cultured woman, and she hoped he would not think her too forward for calling unannounced. Thomas Callahan stood in his doorway and stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his rugged face, and he stepped aside to invite her in. Whatever he thought of her unexpected arrival, he hid it behind gracious hospitality. He offered her refreshment, showed her around his beautiful home, and engaged her in conversation with an intelligence and charm that surprised her. The afternoon stretched into evening as they talked. Eleanor learned that Thomas had been born in Virginia to a wealthy family, but had come west after the war seeking a fresh start. He had built his ranch from nothing, working alongside his men through brutal winters and scorching summers until he had created something to be proud of. His wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, taking their infant son with her, and he had lived alone ever since, pouring all his grief and energy into the land. Eleanor found herself sharing her own story with equal honesty, telling him about her monotonous life in Philadelphia, about her dreams of something more, about the loneliness that had driven her to accept this strange adventure. Thomas listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he truly cared about her answers. By the time darkness fell outside the windows, Eleanor felt she had known this man her entire life. Thomas offered her a guest room for the night, explaining that the ride back to town would be dangerous in the dark. Eleanor knew she should refuse, that spending the night unchaperoned in a bachelor's home would destroy her reputation if anyone discovered it. But she was tired of worrying about reputation, tired of following rules that had brought her nothing but loneliness and regret. She accepted his offer with a gratitude that surprised them both. They shared dinner by candlelight, a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread that Thomas prepared himself. More whiskey was poured, and the conversation continued, growing more intimate as the hours passed. Eleanor could not remember ever feeling so comfortable with another person, so completely herself without pretense or performance. Thomas seemed to feel the same way, his reserved exterior melting away to reveal a man of depth and tenderness. What happened next seemed inevitable, as natural as breathing. Eleanor did not remember who moved first, whether she leaned toward him or he reached for her. She only remembered the feeling of his rough hands on her face, gentle despite their strength, and the taste of whiskey on his lips when he kissed her. She should have stopped him. Every lesson she had ever learned about propriety and virtue demanded that she push him away. But Eleanor was done with should, done with duty, done with the careful, cautious life that had left her so empty. They spent the night together in his large bed, and Eleanor discovered a passion she had never known existed within her. Thomas was gentle and patient, treating her with a reverence that made her feel beautiful and precious. She gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, and in his arms she found a joy that erased everything else. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Thomas was already dressed, standing at the bedroom door with a breakfast tray in his hands. His smile was warm but uncertain, and Eleanor could see questions in his blue eyes that he seemed afraid to ask. She returned his smile, and for one perfect moment, everything seemed possible. The ride back to Cedar Falls felt like a journey between two different worlds. Eleanor's body ached pleasantly, and her mind swirled with confusion and wonder. She had done something irresponsible and improper and absolutely glorious. For the first time in her life, she had followed her heart instead of the rules, and she could not bring herself to regret it. She returned the horse to the livery stable and walked toward the general store, her thoughts still fixed on Thomas Callahan. But as she approached the front steps, she heard laughter coming from inside, familiar female voices raised in amusement. She pushed open the door to find Josephine standing with Lucille Hawkins and the other women from the saloon, all of them staring at Eleanor with expressions of barely contained hilarity. The truth emerged in fragments of mockery and confession. There had been no romantic plan, no sincere encouragement. The women had sent Eleanor to Thomas Callahan's ranch as a joke, a cruel prank played on the naive Eastern spinster who thought herself too good for frontier life. They had expected her to be turned away at the door, humiliated and chastened, fodder for gossip and laughter for months to come. They had not expected her to actually spend the night. Lucille's laughter turned sharp and vicious as she demanded details. Had Eleanor actually slept with the rancher? The question was rhetorical, the answer obvious from Eleanor's disheveled appearance and mortified expression. The other women whispered behind their hands while Josephine stood frozen, her face cycling through horror and guilt and helpless shame. Eleanor did not cry. Something inside her went cold and hard, protecting her from the full weight of the humiliation. She walked past the laughing women without a word, climbed the stairs to the apartment, and began packing her trunk. Josephine followed, begging for forgiveness, swearing she had not known what the women planned. Eleanor barely heard her. The only thought in her mind was escape, the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between herself and this terrible place. She caught the next stagecoach heading east, leaving Cedar Falls without saying goodbye to anyone except Harold, who pressed money into her hand with awkward sympathy. The journey back to Philadelphia passed in a blur of grief and shame, and something else she could not yet identify. She had given herself to a stranger based on a lie, and now she would carry that secret for the rest of her life. Weeks passed, and Eleanor tried to resume her normal existence. She returned to the dress shop, picking up her needle and thread as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The memory of Thomas Callahan haunted her dreams and her waking hours, the feeling of his hands on her skin, the sound of his voice in the darkness. She hated herself for missing him, for mourning something that had never been real. And then she began to notice changes in her body. The nausea came first, striking her every morning without warning. Then the exhaustion, overwhelming fatigue that left her barely able to complete her work. When she realized she had missed her monthly courses for the second time, the truth became impossible to deny. She was carrying Thomas Callahan's child. The discovery plunged Eleanor into the darkest period of her life. An unmarried pregnant woman in Philadelphia faced social death, complete and irreversible. She would lose her position at the dress shop, her room at the boarding house, her standing in the community. Her family would be disgraced, and she would have no way to support herself or her child. She considered every option, including some too terrible to name, but none of them offered any real solution. In her desperation, she confided in Mrs. Crawford, the widow who owned the dress shop. She expected condemnation and dismissal. Instead, Mrs. Crawford listened to her story with surprising compassion, asking questions without judgment. When Eleanor finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment before offering unexpected advice. If the father was a decent man, he deserved to know about his child. And if he was not decent, Eleanor would have her answer and could plan accordingly. The suggestion seemed impossible. Return to Wyoming, to the town that had humiliated her, to the man who probably thought her a fool or worse. But as Eleanor considered her limited options, she realized that Mrs. Crawford was right. Thomas Callahan had treated her with nothing but kindness and respect. He had not known about the joke that sent her to his door. He was as innocent as she was in this whole terrible situation. Perhaps, just perhaps, he would help her. She used the last of her savings to purchase a train ticket west. The journey took even longer than before, giving her endless hours to rehearse what she would say and imagine how he might respond. She prepared herself for rejection, for anger, for denial. She told herself she was doing this for the child, not for any hope of a happy ending. Happy endings were for fairy tales, not for ruined women like herself. Cedar Falls looked exactly as she remembered, dusty and small and achingly familiar. She did not stop in town, could not bear to face anyone who might recognize her. Instead, she hired a horse and rode directly to the Callahan ranch, arriving as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Thomas was in the corral working with a young horse when she rode up to the fence. He turned at the sound of hoofbeats, and she watched recognition transform his weathered face. He handed the lead rope to one of his men and walked toward her, his expression cycling through surprise and something that looked almost like hope. Eleanor dismounted and stood facing him across the fence rails. Her carefully prepared speech vanished from her mind, leaving only the raw truth. She told him everything. She explained about the joke, about Lucille Hawkins and the other women, about her humiliation and flight. She told him that she had not known she was being used as entertainment, that she had genuinely believed he was expecting her. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she told him about the baby. Thomas Callahan stood perfectly still through her entire confession. His blue eyes never left her face, and his expression gave nothing away. When she finished, he was silent for so long that Eleanor was certain he would turn and walk away, leaving her to face her fate alone. But he did not walk away. Instead, he climbed over the fence and took her face in his rough hands, just as he had done that night in his parlor. He told her that he had thought about her every day since she left. He told her that he had considered riding to Cedar Falls to find her, but he was afraid she had rejected him, afraid that their night together had meant nothing to her. He told her that learning about the joke only made him angrier at the cruel women who had orchestrated it, not at the innocent woman who had been their victim. And then he asked her to marry him. Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. He repeated the question, his voice steady and sure. He wanted to marry her, wanted to raise their child together, wanted to build a life with her, on this ranch in the shadow of the mountains. He was not proposing out of pity or obligation, though he would understand if she suspected it. He was proposing because he had fallen in love with her during those hours they spent talking and laughing in his parlor, because giving her up had been the hardest thing he had ever done, because this unexpected child was not a problem to be solved, but a miracle to be celebrated. Eleanor said yes before she could talk herself out of it. They were married a week later by the circuit preacher who passed through the territory every month. The ceremony was small and simple, witnessed only by Thomas's ranch hands and a few neighbors who had no connection to the women who had played their cruel joke. News of the marriage spread quickly through Cedar Falls, and the reactions were varied. Some people sneered about the hasty wedding and counted months on their fingers. Others simply shrugged and wished the couple well. Lucille Hawkins and her friends were reportedly furious that their prank had resulted in such an unexpectedly happy ending. Josephine sent letter after letter begging for reconciliation, but Eleanor could not yet bring herself to respond. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Eleanor spent the months settling into her new life as mistress of the Callahan Ranch. She discovered that she loved the land, the vast open spaces, the endless sky. She learned to ride properly, to cook hearty meals for hungry men, to manage a household larger and more complex than anything she had known in Philadelphia. Thomas taught her about cattle and horses, about the rhythm of seasons on a working ranch, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Their daughter was born on a snowy February morning, arriving with a lusty cry that echoed through the timber house. They named her Elizabeth, after Thomas's mother, and she was perfect in every way. Eleanor held her daughter to her breast and wept with joy, overwhelmed by the love that filled every corner of her heart. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to cold and sickness. There were droughts that withered the grass and forced them to sell half their herd. There were moments when Eleanor wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, trading her predictable life in Philadelphia for this harsh and unpredictable existence. But there were also springs when the meadows burst with wildflowers and the calves played in the warm sunshine. There were summer evenings when she and Thomas sat on the porch, watching Elizabeth chase fireflies in the fading light. There were autumn days when the mountains blazed with color, and Eleanor felt so full of gratitude that she could barely breathe. More children came. A son named William, then twin daughters called Sarah and Margaret. The ranch house grew crowded and noisy, filled with laughter and squabbles and the endless energy of childhood. Eleanor taught all her children to read from books she ordered from back east, determined that they would have the education she valued so highly. Thomas taught them to ride and rope and love the land that would one day be theirs. As the children grew older, Eleanor finally found it in her heart to forgive Josephine. The sisters reconciled through a series of honest letters that acknowledged past hurts and expressed hopes for the future. Josephine and Harold eventually visited the ranch, bringing their own children to meet their cousins. The visit was awkward at first, heavy with unspoken memories, but by the end of the week the sisters were laughing together, as if no time had passed at all. Eleanor never spoke to Lucille Hawkins or any of the other women involved in the cruel joke. She occasionally heard news of them through Josephine, and she noted without satisfaction that their lives did not seem particularly happy. Lucille's husband eventually left her for a younger woman, the others scattered to various misfortunes that seemed like poetic justice, though Eleanor refused to take pleasure in their troubles. On her 50th birthday, Eleanor sat on the porch of the timber house, now weathered but still solid, and reflected on the strange path her life had taken. A joke had sent her to a cowboy's bed, and she had returned carrying his child. What should have been her ruin had instead become her salvation. The cruelty of small-minded women had accidentally given her everything she never knew she wanted. Thomas joined her on the porch, moving more slowly now than he had in his youth, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined by decades of sun and wind. But his eyes were still that striking winter blue, still filled with the intelligence and warmth that had captured her heart 30 years earlier. He took her hand as they watched their grandchildren playing in the yard, the next generation of Callahans growing up on the land that Thomas had built and Eleanor had helped sustain. She told him that she was grateful for Lucille Hawkins in a strange way. Thomas laughed and asked if she had been drinking whiskey without him. But she was serious. Without that cruel joke, she would have returned to Philadelphia and lived out her days as a lonely seamstress, growing old in a boarding house room, never knowing this love, these children, this magnificent wild country that had become her home. Thomas squeezed her hand and admitted that he was grateful too. He had been so lonely before she arrived on his doorstep, so certain that his life held nothing more than hard work and empty rooms. She had brought light into his darkness, purpose into his grief, joy into his solitude. Whatever the circumstances that first brought her to him, he would thank God for them until his dying day. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Their children and grandchildren laughed and shouted in the yard below. The cattle lowed in distant pastures, and the horses nickered in the corral. Eleanor had traveled 2,000 miles and crossed paths with cruelty and kindness, experienced humiliation and redemption, discovered passion and purpose and love. She had come west as a naive spinster seeking adventure, and had found instead a life beyond her wildest dreams. The joke that was meant to destroy her had built something beautiful, something lasting, something true. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.